welcome to everyone who is here today for our, I believe this is our third installment of London Calling, where and most everyone knows who I am. I'm Gloria Kondrup, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hoffmitz Milken Center for Typography at ArtCenter College of Design. It's my pleasure. Unfortunately, I wish you were in person, Paul, to welcome both Greg Lindy, who is a professor at ArtCenter College of Design who teaches our font design program, and the creative director and owner of Lux Typo. I hope I got your name right.
Exactly.
Okay. And Greg will be my host, actually, and leading the charge with Paul. I will disappear from view and throw it into the hands of Greg and to Paul. I will be back when you're finished with your presentation and join you and Greg, and I'll let Greg do the intros and take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so I'd like to say it's an honor to have Paul Barnes with us today. I know we've been trying to get Paul and Christian out here for quite a long time, and we were so excited to finally make that happen. And then the circumstances were such that we've now had to do it remotely, but still quite a treat to have Paul with us, even if it is remotely. A little bit of background. Paul is a founding partner along with Christian Schwartz of Commercial Type. Commercial Type is interesting in such as that it's based in New York, where Christian's at, and also based in London, where Paul is at. Paul and Christian have been working together since 2004. And I think in that time, they've had a really profound effect on the design and typography landscape. The Foundry has published a ton of notable typefaces, but in particular, some that are kind of my favorites are Graphic, Lyon, and Druck, just to name a few, of course. Also, in addition to publishing, releasing fonts, they've also had a deep impact in newspaper publishing, the designing type for that, and branding. Early on, they were involved with the redesign of the Guardian, where they developed the typeface, the type family Guardian, which has since then also evolved even into a bigger, more robust family in and of itself. And in addition to that, I think more recently, we can see their impact on branding, especially with the rebrand of that they were involved with Chobani, and the development of the logo type and the type family for that. And then it doesn't stop there either. They seem to be, I don't know, is there 100 Keebler elves working in the tree for you guys or something? Because it just is nonstop, because just in the last year, they've released commercial classics where they've been shining a bright light on some of the forgotten gems of 19th century type and publishing, and making these available. I don't know if I quite call them revivals, because I think they're in and of themselves these wonderful contemporary takes and have contemporary context in and of themselves. But anyways, they've been releasing that through commercial classics, which Paul will explain. And just last thing I want to say is kind of sum it up. I think it's safe to say that commercial has definitely elevated the way we read, how we design with type as graphic designers, and definitely how we approach type design. And you Paul, you and Christian and the whole commercial team just keep raising the bar higher and higher. So Again, we've been waiting for this time to have Paul visit us and share things. So I'm gonna shut up, and with no further ado, please welcome Paul Barnes.
Thank you very much. Very humbling. And now I'm going to do the magic part where I try and share my screen and get it right. So let's. Right. So this is the talk that we were going to do on our American tour this year. We did a tour back in 2015, and since then we've been busy working on lots of things. So one of the things we've been working on, we were going to talk about, is commercial classics, which is basically old stuff is cool stuff, or as my friend Peter Saville says, from the sublime to the ridiculous. So as I say, we went on tour back in 2015 across America, and since then, what have we been doing? Well, what we've been doing is the kind of thing that foundries do all the time. So Greg mentioned our classic kind of typeface graphic, so we've been expanding that. So we finally released the kind of condensed versions of graphic in many different widths. This is Christian's design. And of course, if you make a condense, you now need to have a wide. But I think probably the other really interesting thing we've been doing with graphic is the kind of language extensions, because I think graphic is a very, very popular typeface, obviously in the kind of, also in the corporate world, you know, this is kind of demand. And also I think we believe in these kind of multilingual typefaces. And also most of the, you know, these typefaces haven't been done by us, but by our kind of partners, graphic Cyrillic, graphic Greek, there's graphic Arabic, graphic Hebrew, graphic Thai, and they were all designed by designers who are experts in this. But the kind of releases we've been doing is Robinson is a release that Greg, who's one of our designers, has been working on. What we like to do with our designers on staff is they kind of do projects and things for us for 4 days. And on the 5th day, they work on their own typefaces. And this was a typeface that Greg had been working on for a few years. And we were very pleased to release it. I think it was back in 2016. We also released our first ever script, Superette, which was designed by our friend Ross Milne, who lives in Vancouver, but was trained at the Royal Academy in The Hague. So that's our first script. Styrene was a typeface Burton released, and this is a kind of interesting typeface in that it's originally, its basis is a kind of a fairly obscure sans serif that Burton found in a Dutch type specimen from the kind of 1920s, but somehow it seems very contemporary. Orientation is a typeface that we released, which is a stencil. It's designed by a very talented French designer, Sandrine Nagu. And I think Sandrine's really interesting because she kind of really comes from more a graphic design background than, say, a type design background. So I think she kind of thinks about the way typefaces will be used. So they have kind of very strong graphic styles. And this one, Orientation, it's called Orientation because originally it was actually a signage face for a university, a college signage system in France. We released Action, which is a typeface by Eric Van Blockland. What's interesting about this is a typeface that was designed for on-screen use for responsive design. And of course, where it's ended up, it's become the kind of corporate typeface of the NBA. This was the identity that Champions in New York did in 2017. Of course, we've continued to do kind of custom typefaces. So I think this is one of the typefaces that we're very proud of. This is a MoMA Sans that was designed by Christian back in 2017. What was happening at that point with MoMA is they were undergoing a rebrand, and they obviously didn't want to get rid of Franklin Gothic completely, but obviously they wanted a new sans serif that kind of reflected that heritage, but worked in all these new contexts and all these various widths. So Christian, as a kind of New Yorker, is very proud that when he now goes to MoMA with his daughters, that he sees his sans serif everywhere. And as Greg mentioned Chibani, which is the kind of collaboration between Burton and Christian. So we designed this kind of serif typeface for them, and also the logo. So some of you may have come to our kind of tour in 2015 and know about the way we kind of think about typefaces. And it's kind of interesting going from yoga to talk about vanilla. We have this kind of idea of typefaces that we kind of think on the one end of typefaces, you have things like graphic, which is we think of vanilla plain typeface, which is a typeface that graphic designers can use every day. And they very much impose, they could be used in any kind of context. And you can impose your will on it. What we like is that some typefaces are still vanilla, but they start to have a slight kind of chocolate chip flavoring, for example. So something like Styrene is a font you can't use it for every job because it's got that little bit of extra flavor. And then you have kind of things like orientation that really isn't vanilla at all, that has a real strong taste to it, and I think can be used on kind of special occasions, so logos or kind of things like that. And we have lots of typefaces in our library. We like to have a kind of balanced library between these very kind of vanilla typefaces and these more display esoteric typefaces like orientation, Dala Floater, things like that, and Superette. Another way we like to look at typefaces is kind of some typefaces we feel very kind of contemporary in where they come from. But there's other typefaces within our library that have some kind of stronger relationship with history, and some of them are very historical. So on the top, orientation, modern typeface. And on the bottom, a typeface I finished in 2017, Chiswick, which is kind of based on kind of vernacular lettering you might find in England from the kind of 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. But even something like graphic has that kind of relationship. You can't really escape history. I think Jonathan Heffler once referred to history as kind of like gravity. And I think something like graphic, it's 10 years old, but if you look at where its kind of heritage, it kind of goes back to something like Helvetica. Well, Helvetica, 1957, that's 63 years ago. So that's starting to be historical. And it's also got its roots in Futura, and Futura's 93 years old. So that's a kind of, everything's, all typefaces may have some kind of history in them. And so, something like Canella, which is a typeface that was designed by another one of our designers, Miguel Reyes, which was released 4 or 5 years ago, very popular kind of high contrast, flared sans serif that you see everywhere. Now, Miguel is a Mexican designer, and he went to the Royal Academy in The Hague. So you've got this kind of interesting kind of, influences within Miguel's typefaces. And with Canella, actually where Canella really, it kind of comes from is the work of William Caslon. And William Caslon, as you know, is kind of like the famed English type founder. People always think of his typefaces as very English, but of course, he actually was very influenced by Dutch type. So you've kind of got this English typeface influenced by Dutch typefaces in the kind of 18th century, recreated by a Mexican designer trained in Holland in the 21st century. I mean, other typefaces within our library have a much more obvious relationship to history. So Austin, which is one of our first releases back in 2010, is very much based on the kind of work of Richard Austin. Where it changes is it has a larger X height, it's slightly compact. It was very much designed for editorial use. And then something like Marianne, which is, again was one of our first releases, has another kind of relationship to history. It's very, very stripped back. In some ways, it's very, very faithful to the original models. It was a kind of idea of like having an album of cover versions. So you have these various kind of Baskerville, Richard Austin, Bodoni, Fournier, Garamond, Grandjean, Fleischmann, and Van den Kier, and you reduce them, you kind of boil them down to basically their skeletal structure. So it's very faithful in one way as a revival, but yet it's very kind of different, contemporary. And Christian and I, at the beginning of our kind of, when we started working together, we always had this idea of maybe a second kind of type foundry. And this type foundry became Commercial Classics. Commercial Classics is a different, I think, approach to history, in that we view kind of typefaces in this project very much kind of from the point of view as when we were designers and art directors, that we would see typefaces in old specimens and old, old posters and things like that, and always kind of go, oh, I'd like that. And almost we don't want it to be shown through the prism of today, that almost like we could just capture it and bring it to the future. Obviously, what we were hoping with them, that we will be able to make them usable for today's users. So, kind of weights and character sets and all those things. But trying to retain, I think, the qualities that we find in the original. This kind of constant, battle between kind of perfection and maintaining the qualities of the original. Kind of trying to look at these typefaces and look at what these creators did and said, is this deliberate or is this a chance, what they, how this character looks. And so when we see this kind of very famous painting, this is a scene from London in 1835, which is kind of where Commercial Classics is very much focused, kind of British type founding from the 18th to the kind of 19th century. When you look at this scene, there's only one thing that to you or I is very clearly still here, and that's St. Paul's. But actually, when you start to look at the playbills, the arrangement of them is old, and we would consider this historical, and if we designed like this, it would be seen as that. But actually, when you start looking closely, you look at these typefaces on there, and as type designers and graphic designers, we can kind of separate the actual application from the actual faces. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of different forms here, Clarendons, moderns, sans serifs, shaded sans serifs, condensed slabs. There's hundreds of different forms, and many of them have disappeared completely. Now, as I said, this kind of project is kind of focusing on the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, which is a very kind of, a period of great change, very much like our period, where you are going from, in Britain, very much an agricultural economy to an industrial one. The Industrial Revolution is fully kind of in full swing. And in this kind of early part of the kind of 19th century, you certainly see this change. So if you look at kind of typography of display typography of these playbills from kind of the late 18th, early 19th century, they kind of still look like book typography. Display typography is simply that you make your serif typeface larger, but you can't, there's no kind of weight change. There's a kind of, it's quite pedestrian. You fast forward into the 19th century, you've got these playbills where you've got all these different weights of type, and size of type, that I think is very kind of, to my eyes, is very kind of refreshing. I mean, in terms of the design, it still retains that kind of central axis, but there's a kind of different way of thinking about design and information. And I think if you kind of take away by the kind of very much in the 19th century thing of putting everything in there, these typefaces to me still have some kind of relevance. So if you kind of look at them now on the street, so we did this kind of campaign when we started this, these typefaces to me still are contemporary. So, Christian and I go looking for these things, or Christian and the rest of us look at these things, and we find them if you look in various places. So this is a playbill from the British Library. It's from 1841. And I've highlighted in here a rounded sans serif letter, which I find very characterful. But when it's in this form, it's of no use to me as a designer. And even if I find it in a specimen, so this is its first example, this is the first ever kind of, we think, rounded sans serif cut in 1836. It's still not usable. And even if you're lucky enough, and we are very lucky, and we'll talk a bit more about this wonderful collection of things at St. Bride Library. And when you look at this is the actual punches. This is still, if you like, an extinct typeface. And it's only when you digitize it that it starts to gain life. And when it's gained life, then you can pass it on to your friends. And we're very lucky when we've been doing this project, which has been going on for a long, long time. We're very lucky that we've got friends like David Pearson, the very, very good designer, who's been using our typefaces. So suddenly this kind of typeface from 1836 is back in circulation. And so the way he's using it is in a kind of contemporary way. And people who don't go, oh, that looks like a very old typeface. Most people kind of think this typeface looks like something kind of from the mid 20th century. So I wanted to talk a bit about the kind of 19th century and why we find this kind of thing, this period, so interesting. Because I think it's, as I say, it's kind of moment when we go from kind of a very heavily book influenced typography to kind of display typography. And also we have kind of developments like the increase in size. You know, technically actually making large type until the 19th century was quite a hard thing. So if you look at the basic typeface of the early 19th century, it's the modern that was pioneered by the Didos in France and Bedoni in Parma, which is now in Italy. And from this kind of form, which has, you know, a vertical stress, very thin hairlines, you know, the kind of, it's very uncalligraphic. You can do lots of different things. So in the early 19th century, the first thing they did to the modern was they created the first bold. So you start to see bold typefaces appear kind of somewhere in the middle of 1800 to 1810. We don't quite know because many of the specimens have not survived and they're often far and few between. So it's hard sometimes to date things. And then from the kind of bold, you kind of then go to the next step, which is the kind of fat face, which I think is the kind of first really major innovation in display typography. You know, you had bold like typefaces before this, but the fat face is really saying to you, you know, I'm very, very bold and very, very heavy. And then, you know, you find also from the bold kind of modern, you find the development of the slab serif. The first slab serifs appear in type form around 1815, but they probably appeared as a letter form much earlier than that. We can find kind of them on woodcuts on lottery bills, kind of like 1808, 1809. And of course, you know, one of the things is with the slab is also if you remove the slabs, you have the sans serif. This wasn't actually how it happened in the 19th century, but I think it's kind of a nice, interesting illustration. The sans serif, we kind of know, is much older. It's a letter form you find back in ancient Greece, you know, 5th century BC, but only kind of reached typographical form really in the 19th century when William Caslon IV kind of released his kind of first sans serif. And then there's other kind of innovations. So you have the Italian where the thick becomes thin, the thin becomes thick. One of the kind of strangest typefaces ever created. And I think a typeface that even today people think of as a kind of strange typeface. And by the kind of 1820s, 1830s, if you like, all the kind of original, I think the kind of most elementary innovations had been kind of discovered. Then they started to kind of make second modifications. So you kind of look at the fat face and you start shaving weight off its side to create the condense. You find the first kind of condensed typefaces, which of course are very useful for making big type as big as possible in a small space. Around 1832, you find the kind of Clarendon or Ionic form in the 1840s, which is kind of effectively a kind of it's a typeface, I would say, that is either a modern with heavier serifs or a slab serif with lighter serifs. And then, you know, in the 1830s, you also find the first kind of light typefaces. There was this kind of fashion to make typefaces look like engravings. So very, very fine typefaces. So 1830s, and this is a typeface we've released called Blanchard, which is from about 1838, 1839. And the kind of, the last innovation, of course, is the Grecian, which if you take a kind of condensed slab serif and you kind of make it angular as opposed to rounded, you get this, which kind of we see in specimens from around 1837, but I presume, you'd find examples in lettering earlier than that. But of course, then what I find interesting about the 19th century is when you start doing multiple things. So if you took a sans serif and you make it condensed and you add an outline and you add a drop shadow, you get Caslon and Livermore's 4-line condensed shaded typeface, which is from around 1838, 1839. Another reason Christian and I decided to work in this period was a kind of a dual one, I think, is that obviously we're a kind of Anglo-American company. And I think that in that sense, many of the innovations we see in Britain during this period are mirrored in America. And by the kind of middle of the century, the kind of tide is kind of going the other way as you start to see innovations made in America appear in Britain. But also you have, during this period, a the actual structure of the letter form, the actual skeletal structure remains remarkably stable. So if you look at the transitional from 1770, you start overlaying them, the modern from 1796, the bold from 1808, the slab from 1816, the Italian from 1821, the Ionic from 1842, the Doric or sans here, this was done in 1876, and the Latin from 1865. When you overlay them, like Adrian Fruedeker did with all his kind of designs, you kind of see there's a kind of similarity in structure. And so when we were making these typefaces, we realized we may only see the words you see in a specimen. So how do we know how the other letter forms are? Well, we kind of know how the skeletal structure would be, and so we can kind of apply it. This isn't to say that you couldn't do this for another country or area's kind of style of letters. So if you look at the top, you have a British slab serif, and on the bottom you have a kind of French slab serif, both kind of cut in the 19th century. And you kind of see within them kind of regional differences. So the lowercase a in Britain always traditionally had that kind of little tail at the end. The French one doesn't have that tail. The French C has a slab ending on both the top and the bottom, in Britain only on the top. And of course in the kind of capital R, which had that very distinctive tail, which you find in Britain and America. Now, another reason for this kind of project exploration is that we are very lucky, or I'm certainly very lucky being in London, to have some Bride printing library on my kind of doorstep. And I've been going there since I was a student, which is many years ago. And this kind of project has kind of two things. One, we wanted to explore this kind of territory, and they have probably the largest collection of specimen books from Britain during this period, so you can really explore it. But also, with every sale we make, we give a percentage of that back to the library, because I think that's a kind of a good kind of thing to be doing, to try and kind of preserve it for the future. But not only have they got type specimens, but they've actually got the physical material of type founding. So pretty much what is left of the Caslon type foundry, which went bankrupt in the kind of 1930s, is there. These are the kind of punches. So that kind of shaded sans serif, the punches for that remain. So this was from Caslon and Livermore around, I say, 1838, 1839. And what's left of the Figgins foundry, so these are the matrices from one size of antique number 6, made sometime in the kind of late 19th century. They also have this, which is an incredible piece of material, which is called the Caslon Scrapbook, which is the collection of proofing documents made by the Caslon foundry in the last few decades of existence, so from the kind of 1870s to the 1930s. And so as type designers, it's very interesting because we can see obviously all the characters, but also they space things, the corrections, and it's just an incredible document. I think also one of the things about this period is that Christian and I kind of like the kind of variation between, I think, sometimes quite crude letter forms or naive. So I think this is a very naive slab serif. It's geometric O, and then you look at something like the N, it's very wide, and it has real character that I think sometimes revivals lose. So you've kind of on that one hand got this kind of crudeness and I think kind of almost sometimes brutal kind of forms. But on the other hand, you've also got very, very elegant letters. So the kind of modern that had kind of appeared in Britain in the kind of late 18th century, by the kind of early 19th century, you get this kind of form, which is the Scotch Roman, very popular, cut probably by a man called Richard Austin. You also cut, you know, referred to back as Austin, which I think is a very, very kind of elegant kind of form. And of course, it fits into our kind of pattern of vanilla. So we have kind of something like Caslon Ionic on the top, which is a kind of a very vanilla, I think, vanilla typeface, maybe with a little bit of chocolate chip in it, which you can use most of the time. And then on the bottom, that kind of the strangeness of the display, the Caslon Italian. One of the things also, of course, is technology has changed since then. So in the 19th century, when they cut these kind of display typefaces, shaded typefaces, one of the kind of innovations they did, they couldn't imagine doing them at kind of small sizes in color. But of course, today that's not a problem. So we can kind of quickly make them into colored, kind of multicolored typefaces and all the possibilities that adds. And so, you know, when I did this cover for wallpaper in 2007, using Caslon Antique Shaded, you know, it's kind of taking it from the history and reapplying it and kind of finding new directions. And one of the kind of really, I think, really interesting parts of this project has been kind of working with our designers. So one of our designers, Tim Ripper, Tim originally was not a designer. He then went to Yale to study design. And he then became a type designer with Tobias. And then he came to us. And one of the projects he's been really working on is the various kind of classics, finishing them off. It's been really interesting to see him looking at these typefaces, perhaps without the historical eyes that I have had from my kind of education. And he's always been interested in kind of things like these ornamented typefaces and how we can make them for contemporary use. So, you know, something like Caslon's rounded in this ornamented shaded version, you know, obviously the first thing we can do is make it kind of two color. But then what's kind of interesting is when you kind of break it up into kind of its constituent parts, how you can make these kind of deconstructed letters, multicolored. You don't have to have every part of it. And I think that's kind of really interesting. I mean, Greg also, who is one of our designers, you know, was fascinated by this form, which was originated by Blake and Stevenson in the kind of late 1830s. And it's kind of interesting because Greg worked very closely with Frederick Balan, who's one of our friends, who's very good at making these kind of little kind of apps that allow you to kind of do this shading a lot quicker than they would have, it would have been to do it manually. And of course, you know, you can make it colored and you can do all these kind of interesting things. So we're kind of interested in where we can take these typefaces. We don't want them to sit in the kind of just as historical typefaces in books. We want them to be used in new and kind of exciting ways. What I'm going to talk about now is some of the typefaces in the collection. Originally, I was going to talk about quite a bit more, but the talk was so long that I think you probably all got a little bit bored. So I'm going to kind of try and talk about, I think, some of the kind of main, if you look at the bookends of it. So kind of on one end of this kind of whole project is a kind of British modern. So in the beginning, it was Brunel. And this kind of shows you either how slow I am or how long these projects take, because it started in 1995 and we finished it in 2019. And it's used, multiple people have worked on this project. Where Brunel kind of comes from personal experience. So as a designer, when I graduated, I went to work in America with Roger Black in magazines. And I was, you know, obviously they use a lot of kind of high contrast serif letters. And when we think about those kind of forms, these are often the two of the names that come up. So the French modern Dido and the Italian, I put inverted commas, Palmer, Bodoni. And of course, when I was in America, kind of this magazine came out, Harper's Bazaar, Fabian Baron's redesign, I think this is 1992, you know, which shows a kind of a Dido designed by Jonathan, very high contrast. And I kind of always thought, kind of, where is the British version of this? It's only really when I came back to London that I kind of started to think about it in a kind of wider kind of way. And I went to some brides and kind of knocked on the door of the then librarian James Mosley, and I said to James, well, what is the equivalent of the Dido and the Bodoni? What kind of typeface reflects that kind of 19th century to 18th century, late 18th, early 19th century kind of thing? And he showed me this typeface, which was cut by a man called John Isaac Drury. It's cut between 1796 and 1799. It's English, which is a kind of a 14 point. So it's effectively a text size of type. And it kind of seemed to me to have some kind of quality, which you kind of see when you blow it up. So it has, I think, the kind of some of the elegance and rationality of the kind of continental model, but it has a kind of British sensibility. And you kind of see it. So on the top, you see one of the first models from Dido, and then in the middle, you see a kind of a Bodoni cut in the kind of 18th century, and on the bottom, you kind of see Drury's work that becomes Brunel. And you kind of see that there's certain characters that lead a distinct kind of impression, that kind of capital R with that tail, very different between the three models, the way the bore terminal end inside the F, the way you have the tail on the A in the British one, and then you look at the kind of G, the kind of proportions of it in the British typeface. It's got much shallower descenders, much has a kind of different proportion. And the italic kind of it feels very different from the kind of Italian and French models. And it's kind of, I find, a very elegant typeface, and James very kindly showed me this, but remarkably, all the punches that were cut in the kind of end of the 18th century survive. And this is a kind of blow up of that kind of 14 point. And I think you kind of see the kind of quality of the engraving, that even though you can see it's been kind of damaged and worn, there's still a kind of high quality to its cut. So when I started this project, I really knew nothing about type design. I hadn't met Christian, so it was kind of very much learning on the job. And I kind of learned quite a lot from Jonathan Heffler, and I kind of made this text version. It kind of was originally for kind of, I wanted to use it myself, kind of text, and it kind of works at text. So this is it in kind of recent use in House and Garden magazine here in London. And it looks great. It's got that contrast, higher contrast. But of course, when you blow it up, the text to display, you realize that actually it's not got so much high, the contrast is lower. It's not quite as elegant. And of course, in the 19th century, every size was cut individually and designed specifically for that size in its contrast and its spacing. So this is one of Caslon's display typefaces cut around 1803. And you kind of see when you blow up the various sizes, how they look. So on the left, you have 12 point going through onto the right, 2-line Great Primer, which is 36 point. You can kind of see there's a greater contrast between them. So when I started working with Christian in the kind of early 2000s, and we kind of started to think, Christian said, it's a lovely typeface, we should do something with it. And it was used for Portfolio magazine. You actually need to do all these things, like you need to have a typeface, a version of it for 24 point deck, we call it, which is kind of for those kind of subheads in magazines. So this is one axis going. So you've got this kind of size axis, and then you have one for headline. So that's kind of for like 60 point and larger. And then, of course, being a modern, we wanted to make one that was for super large sizes, so 120 points. When you kind of see it in House and Garden, when you see it at kind of actual size, everything seems to be at the right, the contrast seems to be right for every size. But of course, if you blow it up, it becomes more obvious that certain sizes, so at the top is the poster, and then below it is the deck, how they have different kind of contrasts. And when you see them all together, you can kind of see that kind of the contrast and the spacing, how things like the balls have become much tighter as you get into the larger sizes. And in the italic, you have a kind of a greater angle as the type gets larger, and the greater contrast and the tighter spacing. So they're quite, you know, they're kind of subtly, you know, they're very different when you see them at this large size, but of course when you see them at the size they're meant to be, you don't really notice that so much. So that's one kind of axis, you know, meeting the kind of demands of users today. But the other axis we wanted to explore, of course, is weight. As I said earlier, the 19th century is this kind of period. So this is kind of typeface cut around 1808. We start to get not only bigger type, but also bolder type. So kind of Brunel expands in this way of kind of multiple weights. And one of the things we wanted to do with this is that even though these intermediate weights may never have existed back in the 19th century, but everything feels authentic. That if Drury came back today and saw them, I would hope that he thought we'd done a reasonable job. We kind of have this kind of very, you know, kind of standard of does it seem to be convincing? But also one of the things is we sometimes think we should break from tradition. So this is getting bolder, but we also thought it'd be interesting to see what happens when you get lighter. When you get lighter, you get a form that you would never see in the 19th century for all kinds of reasons, you know, aesthetics, but also kind of actually making kind of very, very fine type. But today you can use it, you know, large. And of course we did the italics as well, and they have the kind of famed kind of 19th century, very simple swash letters. You see the N and the M and the W and the K. And we did the kind of multiple weights for all kind of sizes. So these are the ones for text, but when you're at text sizes, obviously you can't have that kind of very heavy and very light. It doesn't make any sense. And all the typefaces have all those things you expect in kind of a text typeface, and small capitals, and they have multiple numeral styles. So we kind of finished Brunel, and we kind of thought that's great, you know, we can move on to the next thing. And one of the next things was this typeface, which is a true Fatface, which is embarred. It's kind of strange when we were doing Brunel, our measurement of the heaviest typeface we could find was how heavy was Matthew Carter's Elephant. It's kind of strange because we looked at these specimens and these things were in kind of like, if you like, plain sight, these much heavier typefaces, which start to have in design are like the kind of moderns, but they start to change. And so what we were interested in is what happens when you take something like the bold, you make a black, and then you make the beginnings of a fat face, and then how far can you push it? So this is Isambard, which, you know, we always kind of go back to this kind of analogy of Spinal Tap. What happens when you go up to 11? So this is heavier than any fat face we could find in the 19th century. And we think fat faces have this kind of very kind of delightful kind of quality to them. You know, they are very, very, very bold, but they have a kind of, I think they're a kind of challenge for type designers because you're trying to create as much weight as you possibly can in a space. And so obviously what you do is that certain characters aren't as bold, but overall it has this kind of very strong impression on the page. And, you know, you look at those numerals, I find them particularly kind of delightful. It's only when you kind of look at on the top Brunel and then Isambard below that you start to notice these kind of differences. So for example, the inner counters are all flat-sided in the fat face and they're very, very thin. And those kind of ball terminals that you find in the numerals and the 2 and the 9, but also in the kind of lowercase, you know, the kind of G and the Y and the C and the A. And then how certain characters like the kind of terminals in the E and the F, they go from having any kind of tapering to being just simple straight lines. So that's the kind of Roman. Of course, we wanted to make an italic because italic fat faces are, I think, kind of a splendid kind of creation, this kind of ultra heavy weight and these kind of very characterful swash capitals there that you see in the kind of specimens and the kind of just I find incredibly beautiful. So here's the kind of Isambard, it's kind of numerals and it's very heavy balls. And again, you have to make different design decisions when you're going towards the fat face. The fat face actually has a kind of usually a kind of greater angle than a modern. You kind of see how narrow those in and out strokes become, and how compact it is. And some characters obviously have to change, or it makes sense for them to change. So the lowercase g becomes a single story G. The kind of lowercase v becomes a much simpler form. And again, you know, we've been very lucky that our friend David Pearson has been using them kind of on beer cans. And this is the kind of thing, as I say, we like to see, is like these kind of traditional forms used in a very kind of non-traditional way. And those of you kind of know commercial type, follow commercial type, know that we like to kind of do certain things. And one of them is always, can we make text versions of kind of display faces that don't necessarily seem like they should have it? So this is what Isambard looks like in kind of text sizes. You know, it's starting to fill in. You can kind of read it, but it's kind of, it doesn't feel, it feels a bit tight in its spacing. It doesn't feel comfortable. And kind of in the 19th century, they did start to cut these kind of text fax faces. So this is a kind of another kind of, I think, kind of, you know, for a type designer, a real kind of pleasure to do, which is these kind of, you know, text fax faces, which actually, when you look in detail, are actually lighter than the display versions, but they appear to be as heavy. You know, the counters are a bit more open, the spacing's a bit more open, the italics a bit less angled, you know, but we kind of like it. Now, one of the kind of things that say, you know, we're going and looking at kind of various historical models was the kind of Clarendon form that, as I said, kind of appeared in the 1840s. I think the Clarendon in some ways is a response to kind of changing printing technology and type changing taste and various things, because as the 19th century progresses, the kind of modern typeface like Brunel, it starts to become sharper, the contrast becomes greater, but also you're finding print runs increasing and paper quality declines. And often if you see a kind of finer textbook printed in the kind of late 19th century, you see this kind of modern that feels very weak and sharp, and it doesn't seem pleasant. And of course, when you print it, you know, in things like newspapers, it deteriorates very quickly. So you know, serifs disappear, parts of the higher contrast parts, the letters disappeared. If you imagine printing these every day, what happens? They're not very robust. Legibility decreases. And the Clarendon Ionic form that first appeared around us, as I say, kind of around the 1840s, Caslon, this is Caslon Doric, which is, I think, the first one, predates the Clarendon of the Fan Street Foundry. You know, it is what, as I kind of described earlier, it's a kind of a modern with a lower contrast, but it might also be a kind of more elegant Egyptian. And Caslon released this, and then kind of in the early 1850s, the Caslon Foundry produced a typeface called Caslon Ionic #2. They very kind of created the names. And eventually they cut sometime in the kind of late 1850s, a text version, which Christian and I and Greg and Tim, Cara and Miguel and Bert, and I think all of always admired and loved this typeface because it has a kind of robust quality. This is actually 6-point type. So you can kind of see that it's pretty hard for the kind of thins to disappear. And this can be a kind of model for going forward for text typefaces. When you kind of compare it to, on the top, Brunel, in the middle, you kind of have a kind of what we call a modern from the kind of latter modern from the kind of 1850s. And then on the bottom, the Ionic, you kind of see how they, you know, they change. So it's wider. It's also got a much larger X height. You can see how, compared to Brunel, the X height is much bigger. But it's also got very short descenders. I don't know, they did legibility research to prove this, but you know, it's very much the ascenders and the kind of X height that's the important part. And I think Caslon Ionic #2 is probably you know, one of the most influential kind of typefaces cut in the 19th century. I think also in our kind of contemporary digital world, some of those kind of things that, you know, it was designed, you know, we think for kind of poor print conditions, it kind of works online screen, and it has a kind of, I think, a kind of real kind of no nonsense quality, and you can kind of see where it's gone. So on the top, you see Caslon Ionic, and then in the middle, you see Century Schoolbook, which is clearly influenced by it. And then below, Ionic number 5, the 5th Ionic, designed by Griffith in 1926, which is part of the linotype legibility series for newspapers. I think the kind of Ionic number 5 has many qualities, but I think it kind of loses some of the character that the original had. When they cut it, they never made an italic. So like most of these things, we've had to imagine it. So how we imagine the italic is by looking at something like Brunel, how it would develop, but also looking at some of the text Egyptians that were cut. So in the middle, we see a text Egyptian cut by Thorogood, the Fan Street Foundry in the kind of 1830s. So you kind of see on the bottom what Caslon Ionic number 2 italic would look like, which does look like, I mean, you know, and it's kind of taken, say, the G from the Egyptian and the V from the Egyptian, and the San from the Egyptian, but kind of still has some of Brunel, but a bit more open kind of counters in, say, the E, and a kind of, it's much wider on the horizontal. And, you know, it's being used by our friends again, you know, another one of our friends, Fraser Muggeridge Studio, who very nicely did our wonderful specimen, which you can see on our website. You know, he used a kind of hard-working text typeface for Art Monthly. But then it's been used in kind of very different way by another one of our friends, Richard Turley, who used it for kind of interview and, you know, in kind of very different ways. And we're very, very happy that this is the kind of 100th issue of iMagazine, and they very nicely chose Ionic number 2 for its body copy and kind of display. I think it looks kind of really, really good here. And this is the kind of thing, you know, when we design it, this is, hopefully we're imagining it would be used in somewhere like here. So yeah, it's kind of interesting seeing this typeface from 170 kind of years ago reappearing now, and how it can be used by designers today. Anyway, the next project I'm going to talk about is something kind of completely different. So as strange can be, Caslon's Italian. So as I say, kind of the Italian is a typeface that even today kind of people look at in a kind of strange way. It first appears in kind of type specimens around 1821, the Caslon Foundry. And as I say, it's kind of the thicks become thins, the thins become thicks. So the world is turned on its head, literally. And I think as a typeface, I personally have always really loved it for its kind of, and I do think it is strange. Typographical historians have always been fairly negative about it. So Nicola Gray, who of course wrote the seminal book, 19th century ornamented type, said, you know, it's a crude expression of the idea of perversity. Well, I completely get the perversity, and that kind of feeds very much into kind of the commercial type view of the world, but it's not crude at all. And I think when you actually look at things like the punches, which I'm very lucky to have survived at St. Bride, you kind of see that the quality of this cut is as good as any of the other faces that were cut in the 19th century. Whoever cut this knew what they were doing. It was cut by a man called Selkirk. And this is a typical commercial type, commercial classics project. It starts on a Friday when one of us has an idea for something to do on the weekend when they have a bit of time off. So, you know, I drew the capitals of this, and you can kind of see it next to kind of Brunel, how kind of they are related, how that kind of reverse has happened. It kind of stayed in the kind of, you know, the virtual drawer, and then kind of Christian looked at it, and we knew that there were lower cases to go with Italians. They first appeared kind of in the 1840s, Figgins Foundry, but we never found them kind of convincing with kind of Caslon's capitals. So what Christian kind of did on a weekend probably was he kind of did the same. He took kind of the model of Brunel and kind of reversed the contrast and came up with this lowercase that never would have existed in the time period, but was very, very convincing to us. And this is where it kind of face stood, and Tim you know, I think kind of like the interest in the kind of typeface has been amazing. He kind of said, well, we're going to do an italic. So Tim started working on italic, and this is his first attempt at it. And we kind of looked at it and kind of, this is where we realized that some of the rules that we create or follow from the 19th century, you can break them if it looks better. And this typeface, what we found didn't work with it about it was often where the thicks became thins, that it kind of led to a kind of a spindly, a spotty effect where you can see. And so what Tim decided to do was actually, what you would do in certain places, you would create these kind of serifs at the end of strokes. And I think this kind of gives it a less spotty appearance. So at this point, I thought, you know, Tim had done everything. He'd done the swashes, but then Tim found this, which of course is another one of the perverse typefaces of the 19th century. On the bottom, the contra italic that only appears in Britain, certainly in two different sizes by Figgins and Thorogood, where you've got a reversed angled italic. And Tim said, no problem, I'm going to do that in the Italian. And so he did. And you kind of have this kind of wonderful effect that it gives. And because we're commercial, and we'd like to make these incredibly large character sets of characters that we're not always sure that everyone uses, we've made not only the swash capitals and the italic, but also in the contra. So that's Caslon Italian, which is a very unvanilla typeface. The last project I want to kind of talk about is Caslon Doric, and kind of a bit like Brunel, kind of applying modern systems to kind of 19th century forms. The sans serif is probably one of the kind of distinctive 19th century letters, you know, that appeared in type form. The first one ever, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is that typeface on the third line, W. Caslon Jr. letter found. It's cut by, or it was cut for, William Caslon IV, who would be the great grandson of the original William Caslon. It appears in this one size, in this specimens. It appears in specimens from 1816 to 1819. No one's ever found it in actual use at this time. And then it kind of disappears. It's only in the kind of late 1820s that the sans serif starts to reappear. And it appears in very large sizes in this very kind of bold weight, cut by Vincent Figgins, which has become our kind of original sans typeface, which you can see here in use at the Town Art Gallery. This is a kind of a corporate identity designed by Fraser Muggeridge, and using also Caslon Ionic. And then one of the other next kind of innovations in the sans serif form was these kind of condensed ones that Figgins produced also in 1833, and around this time you kind of find some of the first lowercase. And this is another typeface that we've kind of repurposed, Thorogood Grotesque, which has been done by Greg and myself. And we've done all these weights and added a lowercase. And, you know, that's the kind of, you know, how we like to expand things. Because when we started the kind of Caslon Doric project, we realized that this is the kind of way we see sans serifs now. Which is in this kind of ordered system. This is Adrian Frudica's Univer, which was basically released in one go with all these widths and all these weights and italics. In the 19th century, this never happened. So if you look at the form Caslon Doric, Doric was the name that Caslon gave to his kind of regular width sans serifs. From a period of 1840 to the kind of early into the 20th century, he produced multiple numbers of the typefaces he called Doric, Doric number 1, Doric number 2, Doric number 3, up to number 12. And there's very, very little design consistency between them. And similarly with the kind of condensed, you know, there's no kind of consistency. It's only kind of in the kind of last 25 years of the 19th century that he even thinks of, the foundry even thinks of adding a lowercase. So you've got all these kind of things, and how can you kind of create a kind of a modern typographical system but retain some of this kind of quality? Of course, we started looking, and this is the first ever Doric. this was cut by Henry Caslon in 1842. And it's a kind of regular width, bold typeface. You know, but there's no lowercase for it. You know, this is not a design that we can really, you know, would have much use. The first kind of lowercase sans serifs, they appear in Germany. They appear around 1859. This is one cut by Bauer. It's only kind of in the 1870s that the British type foundries do it. And so Caslon eventually, with Caslon Doric #4, adds a lowercase. And kind of Christian and I kind of looked at this kind of thing. I thought, this is a kind of interesting place to start a larger sans family, which, you know, for contemporary designers, we like large families. So here it is, basically when we started, you know, and it's got this very kind of distinct kind of qualities. It's got like these angled terminals to the characters, so the C, the A, the S, the E, and the T at angle. But it's also kind of got these hooks back in the F, the A, the T, the R, and the Y. And when you kind of compare it, Caslon Doric is in the middle, and on the top you have that Bauer grotesque from 1859 or around then. On the bottom, Helvetica. You can kind of see how something like the capital R of Caslon Doric is quite like Helvetica. But you look at the lowercase g, and Doric's got a double story G. Neither Helvetica or Bauer grotesque have that. You look at the kind of lowercase a and how the tail of that is different between the Bauer and the Doric. So, you know, it kind of fits into it, but is also different from other kind of sans serifs. As Christian and I said, it kind of fits into also the rest of the kind of commercial classics faces. So on the top you have Brunel, in the middle you have Ionic, and on the bottom you have Doric. And you can kind of see the kind of similarities in the way various letters are. And it means that kind of the whole kind of commercial classics kind of package, all these faces kind of can fit together, not necessarily in the kind of a perfect way, but that there's a kind of shared DNA that they kind of perform well. So from a kind of regular weight, we kind of looked to see how light we could be. Actually, in the 19th century, they made very light typefaces. This is a very small size. Pearl is very small, 5 point. And, you know, this is a kind of a trend that happened around the late 1830s, early 1840s, of making typefaces that look like they were engraved. So with Caslon Doric, what we've done is we've made a very, very hairline version. And then we go the other way. And so we went back and looked at what Caslon had produced originally. And you see something like this. This is Doric #6, which appears in the kind of 1890s. But actually, it's kind of interesting because it's actually not a Caslon design. Like all type foundries at this time, Caslon either stole or bought designs from other foundries. So on the top, you see Caslon Doric #6, which is actually Gothic number 2. And on the bottom, you have Caslon Doric regular. And you kind of see how different they are. So, you know, you look at something like the lowercase g. In the bottom one, it's double story. On the top, it's single story. So we decided with this, what we were going to do is kind of create Caslon Doric #4 and make bolder versions of it. And so you kind of see how bold you can go. So to a kind of a weight that you would never see during the kind of 19th century. And of course, we've added all these italics that never existed as well. So it's starting to get to be a very big family. You kind of see in something like the lowercase s, how through the design we've had to change, you know, so you've gone from that kind of way, the terminals are kind of hooked to kind of, they have to kind of lie underneath the kind of main stroke weight. And this means that you can't just kind of create two masters, a very heavy and a very light. What you actually have to do is make something also in the middle. And so from there, we kind of realized we'd then make a condensed. As I say, kind of the early Caslon sans serif typefaces were condensed. They only came in uppercase. It's only in the kind of 1890s that you find this version. sans serif number 6, which is a kind of, we found very kind of characterful, and is kind of the basis for ours. It's got very flat sides. So between the kind of, if you like, the regular width of Doric and the kind of condensed, you find a kind of a different kind of design, kind of aesthetic. So there are shared things, the way the terminals are angled, you know, some of the characters go back, but then there's characters that are completely different. So for example, the capital Q in one has a tail, which is that kind of looped tail in the regular width, which is kind of very typically English. And then below you kind of see a different kind of tail, and in kind of lowercase g in the regular width is double storied, in the condensed is single storied. So you have less weights as well, because when you get to the heaviest weight, you can't make a heavy weight without it starting to get wide. And of course the italic. And the very last bit, you'll be very pleased to hear that I'm nearly at the end, is just also talking about where you go from the condensed, which of course is the other way, the extended. And so the extended typefaces, you start seeing again kind of influenced by engraving, kind of 1840s and 1850s. And we kind of looked at kind of the example that Caslon had. Kind of, he cut this one Doric number 8 on the bottom, and on the top you see Caslon Doric kind of bold, we do. Kind of see the one on the bottom, you look at the kind of O in the capital and you kind of see it's egg-shaped, it's not symmetrical. And we kind of thought, well, this isn't going to fit into our kind of model. So we kind of just took Caslon Doric regular and just kind of made it wide and then extended. So when you kind of look at all the designs together between the kind of the condensed through to the wide, you kind of see how shapes kind of change. So here is the kind of complete family. So effectively, kind of from all this different DNA, we've kind of built this enormous kind of family, multiple weights, multiple widths, but kind of tried to retain the kind of character of the typeface. So the last kind of slides I'm going to show is this, which is something we've been working on. We worked with Pentagram, Michael Beirut and his team, and they've done this kind of mini website, which if you go to our commercial classics, you can kind of click on showcase, you can kind of see it, which is kind of trying to show kind of the various typefaces in use, trying to show them in a kind of a modern application, kind of little film. So this shows lots of Caslon Doric and Brunel and Caslon Ionic, you know, and it's kind of, it's nice now, kind of, you know, this has been, we've done this project's been going on, you know, it's been out for a year now, that we're starting to see it kind of appear. I think this is a kind of a really lovely use of these typefaces. Anyway, this is the end of me. I'm just going to say thank you to the old foundries, to the punch cutters and those who showed the way. And as they say at the end of movies, let's roll the credits. So here are the various members of the Commercial Classics Library. So lots of other typefaces I haven't had the time to talk about. You'll probably be glad to hear. So thank you, everyone. And here's where we are. So thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing now, and hopefully we'll have some questions.
That was terrific, Paul.
Oh, thank you. I'd just like to apologize for my dog.
No, I loved it. You know what? It made you human.
So I guess not necessarily questions, but I think maybe try to have you elaborate a little bit on some things.
Sure.
I guess particularly process. I know that the endeavor to take on a typeface is an investment of time and actually money as well, and it can be very, very long. And I'm wondering, is not so much what you kind of greenlight, but what are maybe some of the obstacles that you encounter in doing a typeface? Because I imagine from start to finish is not just even though it may be long, it's just not necessarily the most clear path, but there's certain things that occur and other other obstacles, and I was wondering if you might be able to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's for each of us. I mean, obviously, so just talking generally about commercial type, a certain number of our projects come from commissions, and you have a client, and that's quite good because the client forces you to actually do something and do it on time. And then obviously we do retail releases, and then all of us have ideas that start off as sketches, and we tend to share those sketches, and we then elicit responses. And then I think if you say a sketch might be 6 or 7 characters, and then develop into that kind of classic string of hamburger font stiff, you kind of start to get enough of the DNA to kind of see, is this going to go somewhere? And then it might go to the full upper and lowercase. And that's often when you show it to people outside of commercial type, and you get another opinion. So talking about commercial classics, we've kind of been road testing these fonts with kind of friends. So they may only be actually virtually A to Z and numerals and some basic punctuation, but that's enough to do a book jacket or a book cover. That's enough to do a can. And so from there, you see how it works, you see, if it's got any issues, and then you kind of carry on. And, as I kind of said at the beginning about Brunel, it's taken much longer than it probably it took Drury to cut them. It's taken a long time, but of course you're working on multiple things at times. I think sometimes the problem can be when you start a project, and you come back to it in a year and you kind of have a whole series of new opinions. That's what's great about kind of custom work, is that, you start and you finish in a quite a linear progression. When you stop and start, you sometimes change your opinion, and that's why it starts to get long. And also you start to realize with something like Brunel, we could add some more weights. We could add some more sizes. And then, let's add a Fatface. Let's do this. And, so there's all, I think, talking kind of generally about digital type, it's great in many ways, but also at the same time, it gives you so many possibilities that at times you just can get lost. And I think particularly when you go into history, there's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down. You're always seeing interesting and nice stuff. And people are always telling you there's other interesting and nice stuff that you should be doing. So yeah, I think editing, as Matthew Carter says, is always like the most important part of type design.
I have some questions, if I can interject, and you'll probably answer these rather quickly. Someone wants to know, and I know some type designers have particular ways of how do you settle on a name for your typeface. And in this case, perhaps it has to do with the historic reference. And then the age-old question from, I think from a lot of students, is how do you determine, and they use the word good and bad typeface, perhaps they mean a well-designed or a well-used typeface, especially with decorative typefaces. I know this can be a touchy situation to comment on it, but how do you determine, and perhaps which revivals to consider?
I think with the naming, there are a few things. Just as a very simple thing, when we started commercial type, I said try and make the letter as close to the start, so your typefaces are always at the top. So that's why I designed Austin, so it's at the top of the list. But seriously, something like Brunel. Brunel is named after an Anglo-French engineer of the 19th century. And that kind of mirrors the kind of who was very influential in building the railways in Britain. But it kind of also touches on that he was from his father was French, so it kind of also mirrors that kind of how the modern came from France to Britain, and the kind of close links between Britain and France. Also, because when I started it, I talked to Jonathan about it, and it was originally going to be called Drury. And Jonathan said to me, but, the problem with that is that some Americans are just going to call it dreary. And you kind of do start to think about, is it going to be an easy name for people to pronounce? And, I think also with typefaces, if you're doing particularly like sans serif, you've got one or two distinctive characters in there that really show the typeface. It's really good to have them in. So if you look at something like, actually Chiswick has a very distinctive K. So it's good that it's called Chiswick and ends in a K, because you can see that. And when you see the name, you go, oh, there's something different about that. So Brunel perhaps is boring in that sense. And your second question about quality, what I'll try and answer it as I perceive you've asked me the question. Again, it's a kind of a thing that's been said there. There are no bad typefaces, just bad applications. I think sometimes you see things and you think, why did someone choose that particular typeface for that particular job? So it's communicating through its visual style the wrong kind of message. So I think during this kind of present crisis, when you've seen kind of maybe a government message set in Comic Sans, I'm not sure it's the right face to be illustrating that point. And so there's that. I mean, in terms of historical revivals, I always try to think, have you kind of captured the essence of the original in some way? And even if you made changes, does it still feel, does it still have some kind of relationship to the original? I think, we think of when you do a revival, it's you're dealing with a kind of a script or a musical score, and you're making an interpretation of it. And how, what is your interpretation? And sometimes, do they capture the essence of it?
Right. And I think you demonstrate how you remain very keen to observing, or to what the original intent was, what the original design was. And it must be very difficult over a long period of time in developing a face. Do you go back and forth as you're developing the different ways?
Yes,
the original,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, also when you start a project, you might find one line on a playbill that says whatever, and then you start working, and then later you find a specimen with more letters in, and sometimes you realize you've completely messed it up and you've got it wrong, and sometimes you kind of confirm that you were right. And sometimes, with some of them, you see what the original looked like, and you decide, actually, I think that punch cutter was having a bad day when he did that G.
Well, you never have
right
a bad day cutting a G. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing is that what we want to do is make things that seem to be, it's a word we often hear, authentic, convincing. So when you look at parts of Brunel that are completely imagined, it seems to fit into the rest of it. It doesn't seem like it's a 21st century botch job. It seems to have a consistency and a quality to it. Does that answer the question?
I guess so. I mean, there's anyone can, who's interested, who's asking the questions, you can always, contact Paul or contact Commercial Type.
Yeah, sure.
Contact Greg Lindy, of course. How is it working with a non-trained type designer in designing type? Someone who started out, who didn't have perhaps type training. And then I think it was that pop art you showed. I mean, someone wants to know what you found in the approach to the designing of the type from a non-type, trained.
Yeah, well, that was designed by Tim Ripper, who's one of our designers, who started off, I believe, in engineering, got a degree in engineering, then went to study design at Yeah, where obviously he started to learn about type design. What I think is interesting with Tim is obviously he's not soaked in the history as perhaps I am, but kind of is just interested in the form, and he's interested in how technology can allow you to make kind of a new version of that Caslon ornamented typeface, where he basically took it apart and made it into kind of, units. And that's how he kind of constructed it. So it's, if you actually compare it to the original, it is different in detail, but I think it kind of gets the effect over. And I think, he kind of saw also the possibilities that you can make in contemporary technology, and I think that's kind of one of the great things about this is like, how can we use these typefaces now? What can we do with them? And that kind of thing of like, well, actually, we're only going to have the top layer and the bottom layer, and we're not going to have layers 2 and 3. And you've created something quite different. And, I think different designers who use it will have very different color palettes, different materials they're going to make things in. There's all kinds of possibilities for it, as well as someone who's probably going to use it for a marmalade label in quite a traditional way. I mean, we're not against people, we know that some people are going to use these typefaces in a particular way. We're not against that in that. We just think that where we personally would use it, we're kind of interested in exploring these new spaces and the contrast between the modern and something that's kind of old.
So I have one more question from someone. I know that you and Christian have extensive libraries. I remember in visiting the offices, extensive book libraries, and it's, from my point of view, I think it's fabulous to know that the value of having books and libraries. What would you say, in addition to visiting typographic archives, such as you're so fortunate, like you said, St. Bride is just unbelievable. I could, I could die in their library and hope no one will find my body. I'd like to be buried there. But what would you say, if beyond, research and very specialist, what essential typography editions do you think have been very influential in you that you still go back to in terms of books?
Well, I'm trying to remember. My grandfather was a journalist before the Second World War, and he had a book on type. He actually had 2 books. He had type. I can't remember the exact title. He had A.F. Johnson's kind of book on the kind of development of type. But there was also a book by, I can't remember the name. It's called Typefaces of the World. And it was obviously aimed at kind of newspaper editors, and it just had lots of characters. And I kind of still look at that book. I think Bartram and Sutton's Encyclopedia of Type Forms, the kind of big book, is always something I like to go back to. But obviously, a lot of it is also you pick up specimens. We've always been avid collectors. And even some, kind of quite recent specimens, are amazing, and quite a lot of facsimile ones of kind of old ones. So there's, I think it's the kind of course, like Type Specimen Facsimiles 115 that was produced in the 1960s, which is again a big thing, which kind of shows the kind of the specimens from the kind of beginning of kind of time. But there's also Chickold's Treasury of Alphabet and Letters. I seem to remember getting that for like £2 from a bookshop somewhere back in the 1980s. So, I think, there's a lot of books if you want to look secondhand as well as a kind of huge amounts of online resources now. Perhaps almost too many sometimes.
Sometimes, right. And
yes.
Greg, unless you have anything to add.
I just wanted to add to that as well, because I think there are the resources such as specimens and whatnot, but I'd also encourage to just, just pick up anything. I mean, you can find like old magazines and whatnot where you're seeing the type in action, and you're seeing the decisions from these art directors and whatnot. I mean, like old Esquire magazines and seeing George Lowe's decisions on how to use the type, or other really notable art directors throughout time, and just see how they use type. And even in contemporary sense, I mean, not to kind of, you know, blow smoke here, but I mean, just wallpaper in itself. I mean, it's a great magazine because of these decisions. I mean, there have been really smart decisions by the art director, design director, you know, to choose particular typography, which happens to be commercials, or in a, you know, but also just, you know, finding those publications where it's just that design essence and that sensibility around typography really just shines. And I think there's so much to learn there. So it can be contemporary, it can be searching deep. I mean, I think what we miss a lot, not because of pandemic, but just because general kind of technology is we're so quick to just kind of see if it's Googleable and then have it sent to us. But, you know, there is this, the treasure hunt of going out and, you know, digging through things, smelling things, being surprised, you know, it's just.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I would invite Paul, when the pandemic is over, or you're able to travel, you should come to ArtCenter, and you should.
Oh, absolutely.
I will let you loose.
Absolutely.
Press, in our press that contains quite, and Greg knows this, that contains quite a bit of type that of course was never digitized. Make it to linotype, and you and commercial type can have their field day if you wish.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
I mean, I should also give I guess one of the other things in America is obviously things like the Letterform archive, and they're starting to put a lot of stuff online. And, you know, I have to say, when I look at things like the Letterform archive, or I go to St. Bride's, even now, I constantly discover something new, and that makes me very happy.
Yeah, that's what we've done at the HMCT. We have an archive, and we're as well, and it's smaller and younger, but we're archiving and proofing we call it the living specimens.
Yes.
From our type foundry. So, and it's available for any educators and students to use and download and, you know, have at it, so to speak. So, and as we continue to add, especially to our living specimen sheets, I think it's important. We agree with you 100% at the center that accessibility is number one.
Yeah.
And usability, you know, for what you find. I mean, it's always better to do on-site research, as always, to actually hold the specimen in your hand. But if you can't do that, then the next best thing is, as much as you can. I mean, I wish St. Bride was more digital, but as we all know, that takes a lot of funding, you know, and that's one of the issues.
That's why we're trying to give them some money.
I know. I've given them money. But
I mean, I would also say one of the things we did with commercial classes, we do with commercial typists, we do specimens, I think, because there's still something great about a printed specimen, you know.
Absolutely. And how can you, do you still have them available, the printed specimens?
If you look on both commercial top and commercial classics, you can see the various specimens we've done. There's both the kind of deluxe one and a kind of simpler one, and there's also various other kind of things. There's a letterpress poster, and I'm trying to think of, well, there's lots of things you can get, and some merchandise and t-shirts and stuff like that as well. Well,
that all goes toward making sure that the field of type design survives. I think it's very important. I want to thank you so much, Paul and Greg.
Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there.
Yeah. It's our pleasure, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Greg. Paul, we'll see you soon. We're going to bring you into Greg's class. For his students who are listening.
Yeah.
Beware. He's going to be critting your work.
Right.
And again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at our next salon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you, Paul.